Wait,
Hello,
wait, I changed my mind,
everyone.
I'm not ready, can we please
Shut up, Icarix! Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our next part in our Carthage Let's Play.
And he's Kunagosis, and he's a massive shithead. He's making me do this against my will when I'm not ready.
Just ignore him. It's, you know. Yeah, so in our last part we reached our thorax reformers finally, so we got us nice snazzy units and we had a nice battle to showcase some of them.
It only took us 14 goddamn sessions to get to these bloody thorax reforms.
Well, because they take a while. You had to get to like turn I'm trying to think on the top of my head, I think 160? 140.
Sure as hell makes you wait. Sure as hell makes you wait for it, I'll tell you that much.
Well, yeah, two reforms as Carthage, one around turn 60, the other around turn 140.
Okay.
You know, and this is the final reform. As I talked, I think, the last part, most factions get like maybe 2 reforms at most. Only like Rome and Parthia and maybe Media Atropatane get 3 reforms.
How come no one else does?
It's just kind of no need, to some extent.
Is that the mindset of the developers? They just figured that, like they figured no one else really needed reform, so they just focused on these. It just
kind of goes with the sort of historical developments of their military that is broadly followed, that the mod broadly goes by.
That actually makes a bit more sense.
Like,
historically,
when it comes,
it does, yeah.
Yeah, like when it comes to say the Greeks, and of course they're not a monolith, but broadly. Although, you know, this is gameplay bit that lends it that takes its own liberty to it, but I suppose the significant development, which I suppose Tereos Thorax reforms reflect, is simply the adoption of the Tereos shield, hence the Tereos reforms, and then I suppose the influence of the Romans leading to some more reliance in heavier loose order infantry. Quickly aside, we are starting our assault on the Tulingi. We have an army.
We were positioned right outside Korea, it appears.
Indeed, and then we send this army to go up here and push off these armies. It's an unresolvable affair, not worth fighting.
Well, we're slipping back into old habits there, are we, Kunagosis?
No, do you really think it'd be worth showing something like this? But, to get back to what I was saying, I guess you could say that the Tereos reforms reflects the adoption of the Tereos shield, and Thorax reforms reflects the idea of, I guess, a sort of Roman influence, if you want to look at it that way, although even the Roman element is historically maybe a bit debatable. But at least that's sort of the idea here. They're 2 slightly different events in history, or that were notable changes to how Greeks, many of the Hellenistic kingdoms, had their militaries. So that's why they'd have 2 reforms. Let me try to think. When you're talking about like the reason why Rome has 3, well, I suppose it's because they went through quite a lot of changes. They were around for a very long time.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, it was the biggest empire in the world back then. You'd figure they'd have multiple changes around that time.
Oh yeah, like you're talking about, by the time this game starts, they're using manipular legions, but still pretty early days. And they hadn't become even the kind of heavy-duty armies that even Polybius talked about yet. So that's why we have the Polybian reforms. Like, the adoption of the Gladius Hispaniensis, or the Gladius, the famous sword the Romans use, was probably not till maybe during or after the First Punic War. And this mod predates the First Punic War by a few decades, or by a decade or 2. Looks like we're about to go into a battle against the Tulingi. We are fighting some armies, including, I suppose, their garrison.
Well, you know, we actually decided to stick around for this one. Well done, Kunagosis. You actually managed to commit to something.
Yeah. These are this is the Massalian Thorax Hoplites. These are the late Sacred Band.
And who are we fighting against this time?
The TULINGI.
The TULINGI.
Yes.
Who are they exactly?
Historically, I don't know a whole lot. I barely know anything. They're based in the Alps, so they're possibly or probably Celtic-based faction, and I think this is how they're represented in this game. As a kind of Alpine Celtic faction.
Interesting.
And we have our Tarantine White Shields. But, so to get back to what I was talking about, so you're talking about the development of the so-called Polybian manipular Romans is not for probably a few decades after the starting date of this mod. So it makes sense that you want the Romans to change into that. But because the time span that's being covered in this, at least in theory, you're going to want to show the later changes of the so-called Marian reforms, which reflects the idea of the Roman legions being more professionalized into a formal full-time army rather than just a militia of landowning citizens. The actual historicity of this, though, is dubious, and even the devs are open about that. Cam has often talked about how there was no real Marian reforms. The idea
that's just something they made up?
Not necessarily. It's one of those that's very, you could say, in popular history understanding, there was this reform by a guy called Gaius Marius that completely overhauled the Roman legions into a full-time professional army. But I think the reality is it's more complicated, and a lot of the changes attributed to him were already kind of done earlier. Like opening up recruitment to the common citizen was something that was said to have been done since the Second Punic War, which would have been about probably a century before Marius. I think even in Marius's career, earlier in Marius's career, there was the Jugurthine War against Numidian kingdom led by Jugurtha, and apparently, I don't know for too definite, but I think even then the Romans were fighting in cohorts then. So it's more like the reality is more complicated than the idea, but DI has to go for some degree of compromise between actual history and gameplay. The final thing Rome gets,
weavings to this tapestry, basically.
Yes, and then the final reform Rome gets is the imperial reforms, reflecting the military at its peak imperial in the early empire.
Are we close to that stage yet, or have we already passed it?
In terms of right here in our campaign, we don't get really to that stage. Rome certainly doesn't.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a shame.
Yeah, see, you have to wait to get to imperial reforms. You're looking at probably over 200 turns.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like, to play as Rome, if you're playing as Rome, you're looking at like turn 200, little after 200, and like Imperium level 7. So way late into the game before you reach those reforms as Rome. The other faction that I know gets 3 reforms is Parthia. I don't know too specifics about Parthia, but I think it's meant to reflect this gradual change within Parthian society. Starting out as a kind of steppe nomadic tribe known as the Parni, to becoming, I guess, something closer to I guess a proto-Sassanid empire. To explain to you better, so you've probably heard of the Persian Empire.
Yeah, of course.
And then the Persian Empire, led by the Achaemenid dynasty, falls to Alexander the Great. Alexander's empire fragments, and a lot of what is former Achaemenid holdings fall to the Seleucids. Some of that territory, particularly a region called Parthia, which is near around Iran, got settled by a group of people called the Parni, a sort of steppe tribe, Scythian-like. And they became quite powerful over time. and would effectively kind of dominate over much of Seleucid lands, I think, as that empire weakened. And they became major rivals to Rome. But eventually, the Parthians would fall to a dynasty known as, I think, the Sassanids, who ruled Persia, a Persian empire of their own up until the Muslim or Arab invasion, which was probably like early medieval period. So I guess to reflect that idea, the Parthia gets these gradual changes from like going almost to be proto-Sassanid. And that's why they get 3 reforms.
I guess when you put it all together, that does kind of add up.
So it's all quite interesting. But most factions will get 1 or 2. There's usually not much need for more than 1 in most cases.
Unless they're basically unless they're special unique circumstances.
Yeah,
basically.
Unless there's some really special elements. But,
yeah, of course.
To focus on what's in front of us, we have our Libby Phoenician Thurao swords fighting some, I think these are probably some levies or tribesmen. And they're holding their own. Of course, we got some very professional, well-equipped Thurao swordsmen against some tribal levy spearmen.
Is this part of, as part of the new reforms, I'm assuming there's like new weaponry for us to play around with?
New weaponry? Can't say there's so much new weapons, but certainly the Libby Phoenician Thurao Poroi are wearing better gear than the Libyans. The Libyans may have sometimes worn a linothorax. Some models had a linothorax for body armor. Maybe they had helmets, but not really much. The Libby Phoenicians just have proper body armor and helmets. They have better armor.
Because I was under the impression that because of all these reforms and all of the different disbanded units and newly arrived units that we brought into our forces, I was always under the assumption that there would just be like new skills for us to play around with, or just like maybe armor, weapons, new units, or just like basic archery.
Well, I guess put it like this: you're getting some new things. The Libby Phoenician units are still Thurao Poroi, so they still have like a Thurao shield, and they still have a sword, spear, javelins. It's just the Libby Phoenicians are fully covered in linothorax kind of armor, wearing armor, whereas the Libyans didn't always have armor. The thorax spears, well, that's a significant change from hoplites. They're equipped with a scutum shield, and they fight in looser groups. They're not as slow. The swords, they're equipped to like Copsides, which is like a Greek type cutting sword, or a Falcata, which is an Iberian sword. And they have a scutum and heavy armor like chainmail. So you probably get more chainmail being showcased in this point.
And I assume it's pretty powerful chainmail regardless.
Well, your chainmail itself is pretty powerful.
Well, I know, I just thought it'd be like a slight upgrade or something. I'm just grasping at straws, honestly.
Reforms aren't always pure upgrades.
No?
Not necessarily. Sometimes you may get a better unit, but it comes at some other cost.
Oh, okay.
Like, take, for example...
It's not necessarily, oh, you get a new reform, and because of the time that's passed, you get a new skill set. It's basically just like you get
newer units, and they might be better than your older ones. They could even possibly be worse in some ways. Like, an example in some ways of this balancer. You look at Carthage here. As I mentioned, the Libby Phoenician Thurao Poroi. In one sense, they are an upgrade over your Libyans because they're better armor and morale.
Yeah.
But the downside is they're from a higher population tier, your second class. So means,
what does that mean?
So that means that they're from a more limited population pool.
Oh, okay.
Another similar instance to look at would be Rome in the Marian reforms. So your Hastati and your Principes will turn into legionaries. What are the general ups and downs to this? Well, to make it simple, let's compare the Principes to legionaries. The Principes are still kind of a little stronger than legionaries. They're a little bit better. So in some ways you're getting a downgrade. But the upside is legionaries are from your third class. Your biggest population pool for your citizens. So that's kind of like almost reverse. You get this kind of maybe a little weaker. But they're at a lower population group that makes them more disposable.
So, like, are you bound to, like, with these new reforms, do you have, like, a balance of, do you sort of get, like, a balance between positive and negative outcomes? Or
To
is
some
it
extent, yeah, there's an element of that. Like, even if there's no change in population class, the reformed unit might be more expensive. For example, even though that's probably a minor thing, because you probably have a good economy by then.
Yeah, but there's also the possibility that you'd have to raise taxes in some province just
Potentially.
to keep,
Well, you
just
can't
to
raise
afford
taxes.
the new troops, just to afford the new troops.
There's that element. It's always going to have some cost benefit
There'll
thing.
always be some cost and benefits that
Yes.
you'd have to work around.
So sometimes they can be a straightforward upgrade in some level. Like Thoreau's reforms for most Greek factions is actually really good and doesn't really have any downsides. You get Thoreauporoi, which helps supplement the weakness of your phalanx. It's supposed when you get into Thorax, you might have some issues. I say issues, not really a problem, but you know what I mean. Carthage are not a Greek faction, but they're Greek influence, so they're a little different. The Idrisians, I'm trying to think, they get two reforms, Thoreos, Thorax. Thoreos, I don't think there's any real downsides. Your units get stronger, broadly. Thorax, I think there's going to be some element. I suppose even one thing is the change from hoplites to thorax spears, is what Carthage gets, the Libby Phoenicians. Hoplites will have better defensive abilities, but they're slower, less mobile. Thorax.
I was under the impression that, hoplites are more defensive now.
Yeah, the thorax spears, they have better shields, and they'd be probably a little stronger in other ways, but they wouldn't have as good defensive capabilities as hoplites.
And I see the elephants here are here to
Yeah, our
spike up
Aptus
a bit of
elephants are
rampage.
crushing the enemy up.
flailing them around like seesaws, or
Yes.
swings actually.
It's been a somewhat bloody enough battle, and the thing is, because of the nature of it, we didn't really utilise our hoplite troops too much, I don't think. There wasn't too much of an ideal chance to utilise them. It's probably a bit more of a chaotic battle. So we're still dominating.
Very much so.
It's really our spears and melee infantry that have been doing the bulk of the fighting, as well as our cavalry.
So that's basically all that's needed, honestly.
Well, we're seeing the victorious chants.
Sure, the battle was over before it even started. They were on their knees before they even knew it, begging for mercy.
Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of those Celts running around the thorax. But they're probably not pure Celts, anyways.
No?
Not really like there were pure Celts. They weren't a singular monolithic ethnic group.
Oh, no, definitely not. No,
They were
you'd
more like
expect
a
there to be
loose
some
group
range.
of. Even
You'd
then,
expect
that's
there to
more
be
like
some
our
range
own.
somehow.
That's kind of our own little terminology to call them collectively Celts. But we're running out of time to really delve into this rabbit hole. Maybe in the next video we'll talk about that.
Yes, indeed.
Let's say I got into quite a bit of an argument in r/Celtic about that sort of thing.
Well, I'm sure the dear viewers will be more than happy to listen to what you have to say.
Perhaps. But, thank you all for watching. Hope you
Be
enjoyed
sure
this
to leave
video.
comments, like, and subscribe, and we will see you all very soon.
Indeed.